One. Hi, everyone. Today we are going to be talking about sexual abuse in children. So, we looked at different research and statistics in order to support our claims and see how important counseling is in order to help with sexual abuse in children. We are very aware that sexual abuse in children is a real problem, and we just looked into it a little bit more to see how important the counseling relationship along with children who have been sexually abused relationship is with one another.
So, to first introduce our topic, we thought that it was really important to give you guys a definition of sexual abuse in children. There are many different definitions out there that you can also get from different resources. But for the most part, all definitions are pretty similar. There's just a few nuances between definitions. One that we found to be pretty clear cut and we thought was a good definition was from the National Child Traumatic Stress Network. So they define sexual abuse in children as any interaction between a child and an adult, which an adult in this term is referring to 18 and up, or another child, which the child is used for sexual stimulation of the perpetrator or an observer. And then it's also important for us to note there are different categories of sexual abuse. I think when we typically think about sexual abuse, it's with a pretty narrow lens, but sexual abuse actually can look like many different things, and that includes touching, non-touching, voyeurism, exhibitionism, and exposing the child to pornography or having the child engage in some type of pornography. So as we continue looking at this topic, it's important that we look at some facts and statistics to help us get a better understanding of what does sexual abuse actually look like in children. So the first thing we should know is that unfortunately, most children actually know their abuser. Typically, this is someone in their family or their extended family, such as aunt, uncle, grandma, grandpa, cousin, something like that. Or sometimes the abusers can be family friends or something along those lines. Just unfortunately, research shows that most children do know their abusers, which is sad, and it's definitely something that we need to recognize. So, as for how many children have been sexually abused in the United States specifically, the CDC says that 1 in 4 girls are sexually abused and 1 in 13 boys are sexually abused. On a more global level, it's also important to look at the statistics because sexual abuse is not just in the United States. Unfortunately, it is a global issue. Globally, 19.7% of females are sexually abused as children, and 7.9% of males are sexually abused as children. So, from both statistics in the United States and globally, we see that women are typically sexually abused as children more often than men. However, that does not mean we should dismiss the statistics it shows for boys. Obviously, both genders are experiencing it, and we have to recognize what it looks like for each gender. And then, one other thing we wanted to note was the statistics of disclosure, which refers to children and adolescents that will actually eventually tell or seek help for the abuse they've experienced. 50% of survivors typically will disclose during childhood and adolescence, and then 20 to 30% never disclose. So, obviously, 50% is a great statistic. However, it is still sad that there is closer to 30% that still aren't disclosing that type of information. Because, as we'll see later on, if we don't disclose, or if children who have been abused don't disclose that information, it has some pretty tough consequences for them. So, like I just mentioned, if children are not disclosing information of when they're sexually abused at some point in their life, we see there are many different types of consequences. Particularly, the CDC has some great information on consequences for children that have been sexually abused when they do not disclose information. Obviously, there is emotional trauma that can come and physical trauma. it's important to recognize that there can also be physical trauma to the body of a child. I think when we think of sexual abuse, we typically think of the emotional consequences it can have, but it can also have physical trauma on a lot of children. And then some other consequences that there might be is obviously risks of STDs, which is sexually transmitted diseases, a variety of mental health disorders. Of those mental health disorders, the most typical ones that we see in children who have been abused sexually are depression, anxiety, and of course, PTSD, which is post-traumatic stress disorder. And then some other consequences can also include emotional and behavior consequences. Emotional consequences for children who have been sexually abused look like a lack of trust, confidence issues, insecurity, lack of boundaries. And then behavioral consequences, they might not appear right away, but sometimes it's usually typically after a couple of years that the child has been abused. They might struggle with substance abuse, risky sexual behavior, risk of self-harm, and an increased risk of suicide or suicide attempts. So obviously the consequences of children being sexually abused are great. So why is this important to counseling? I think the biggest thing is that this is a real issue and it happens more often than we think. I think when we think about the counseling scope, we typically think about more everyday issues. And sometimes we forget that there is trauma that people experience, and sexual trauma is sadly a real issue. And as we've seen, it negatively impacts children. So, as counselors, especially if we work with children and adolescents, there's a chance that they have been sexually abused. Like the statistic said, it's typically 1 in every 4 girls and 1 in every 13 boys. So if you have a child or an adolescent as a counselor, there's a high chance that they have been sexually abused. And due to that, we have to be educated and informed to help our clients who have experienced sexual abuse as a child. What this means is we need to be attuned, we need to notice the signals and recognize the signs of abuse. Sometimes children will not bluntly come out and say it, as we saw from the disclosure statistics. Not everyone will come out and disclose that type of information. So we need to be attuned to that and notice signals or signs of abuse in our children that are clients. And then just an important thing to remember is that as counselors, if someone is disclosing information to us, we have to remember that disclosure can either cause healing or hurting for the child. And our role is to do minimal hurting and maximum healing.
All right, now looking at the relevance of sexual abuse in the realm of minority populations, we are able to see that there are major connections between socioeconomic status and both mental and physical health. And I'm going to be referring to socioeconomic status as the abbreviated SES. So when looking at socioeconomic situations, it's important to understand that there is different types of exposure to different situations depending on socioeconomic status. The article that I used for this has a quote and it says, low SES environments are thought to be associated with greater exposure to frequent and intense harmful or threatening situations and to fewer rewarding or potentially beneficial situations. So being in a lower SES has the potential to put children specifically in more situations that could be more intense and harmful and actually threatening to them. And then it goes on to emphasize how lower SES is correlated to more frequent negative life events, as well as chronic stressors. And these are just stressors that are recurring and on a daily basis. And so, yeah, a lower socioeconomic status is correlated to more frequent negative life events. That's not to say that negative life events don't happen and that sexual abuse doesn't happen in other socioeconomic situations. It's just to say that when being raised up in a lower SES, it can be correlated to increasing the risk of a child experiencing sexual abuse. Another interesting piece of information that I got from this article is it says that research shows that marital dissolution specifically leads to greater risk for physical health problems in adolescents, including substance abuse and sexual promiscuity. And then it continues to go on. But what I took away from this was that in a lower socioeconomic status, there's greater chances for marital dissolution and leading children to kind of act out and put themselves in more harmful situations. That can just be like getting involved in the wrong crowds, hanging around with unsafe people, increase of sexual promiscuity, just putting themselves more in harm's way, which can just make it a lot more, just make it a lot more, it's just easier for them to be put in situations where sexual abuse could occur, abuse or assault. And so then the last quote that I want to look at is that low SES children are at a heightened risk for physical mistreatment or abuse and exposure to family violence, and they are at greater risk of being in family relationships lacking in warmth support. And I think that it's really important to recognize that if you're growing up and you have something traumatic like sexual abuse happen to you in your adolescence, support systems are so incredibly important and beneficial. And so having a lack of familial support can overall affect a child's ability to heal and cope with any form of sexual abuse that they may have experienced. And then also just some of the more obvious things with it being relevant to a lower socioeconomic status is that if children are experiencing some form of sexual abuse, then it can be harder for them to get the help that they need, such as like one-on-one therapy, which can be a lot more expensive, or like a lack of insurance, and other things of that nature. So now looking at the appraisal of how this problem is addressed by mental health counselors, the article that I looked at specifically emphasized a group therapy model, which was very focused on the empowerment of the clients within the group. It goes on to say that it was providing a model that is intended to actively highlight and help clients connect with their personal strengths and resources and facilitate their growth and development. So again, this group model really emphasized the idea of empowerment. It was also an Ericksonian-based form of therapy. How it was based on some of Erikson's studies were, according to Erikson, adolescence is the time in which the primary task is for the individual to develop individuality and autonomy in their family, as well as establishing a stable self-concept and identity. Erikson also believed that when a person shifted out of a stuck position, whether that be positive stuck positions, or whether that mean they shifted in a positive direction or negative direction, either way, in his eyes, they were still shifting, which meant that they were capable of change. And if they were capable to shift positively or negatively, they were capable of making shifts towards overall wellness. Another thing about this group therapy model is that it is cost effective. It is a lot cheaper to go to support groups and group therapy than it is to go to an individual one-on-one therapist, like say somebody with a private practice. This group also focused on some cognitive behavioral therapy for the young girls, it was specifically a support group for girls ages 12 to 16, and they had all had confirmed history of sexual abuse. So yeah, this group was focused on active, short-term, strength-based approaches. And these active, short-term, strength-based approaches was basically they helped clients possess their own inner strengths and resources, and help them find any resources that they needed to resolve their own problems. Not to say like, oh, you need to help yourself, but more of like building up that, okay, I can be okay with myself. I don't need to rely on other people to help me. Like, I have these strengths, and help them to identify them and apply them. So some ways that they did this throughout this group approach was they did different types of therapy, such as letter writing, storytelling, and then other tangible forms of interventions. But I thought this was interesting. The letter writing form of therapy was they would have the girls in the group write letters either to future selves or to family members or to perpetrators, or letters to like imaginative people. They obviously did not have to do anything with the letters. It was more just like being able to write out like what had happened to them, or write out like where they wanted to see themselves in the future. And it seemed to be pretty beneficial for those girls. And then also the storytelling would have been more so like a facilitator of the group, like a counselor who was there would read these stories to the group of clients. And like one example of them was, it was a story about a caterpillar who was turning into a butterfly. And the idea was that the girls or boys, because there's groups for both, but anybody in the group could kind of listen and try and insert themselves into the story and recognize different coping mechanisms and different strengths of the characters within the story that they could then associate with themselves to help with their healing process. Some reasons that I thought group therapy was a good idea for this type of trauma was because it helps to establish a community, and especially in adolescence, I think it's so easy to isolate at that age, even just in like small things. Like middle school is hard, let alone like going through sexual abuse and trauma. Like the isolation can just be so big. So I think that them getting to come together and realize I'm not the only one who's going through this, and I'm also not the only one my age that's going through this. Yeah, and then one last quote that I wanted to point out was that the article states, helping participants identify competencies that they already possessed with the intent of helping participants use these competencies as a method of coping with the aftermath of abuse. An important part of this that I really want to point out is the identifying competencies that they already possessed. This is important because the clients need to know that they have these strengths and qualities within them, and just because they've gone through something terrible doesn't mean that those are stripped away from them, and it doesn't mean that they can't apply them to themselves now and moving forward. So yeah, that's how this is addressed by mental health counselors today.
Okay, so to conclude all of that information that we have, it's clear that sexual abuse negatively impacts children. And that idea was really present throughout this presentation, throughout the different research that was presented. So Mia presented some really good research about the different statistics and how disclosure was a lot lower because children did not feel like they could disclose the information with anyone. So that was really interesting. And then the ratio between girls and boys being sexually abused was also really interesting, but it's really clear that sexual abuse really negatively impacts children. this problem is real and it's really common. That was very present throughout the research that was found. As counselors, we need to be able to look at the signs of when this may be happening, and we need to be present with our clients in order to ensure that they can trust us. So a big factor that's really important for us to understand is the idea that connection heals. So this idea basically is that having a good connection with your client-therapist relationship is so important. That is one of the most important parts of counseling, is having a good connection. This allows for trust to be formed, confidentiality to be formed, and just overall just having the client be able to trust that the therapist is safe and that they are present in their pain. That is something that's really important. Connection is the most important thing. And Mia talked about earlier about how the numbers for having I forget the word, but having people come and like speak out about their sexual abuse was pretty low because they didn't feel like they could trust anyone, or if they felt embarrassed. There could be many different reasons of why they might feel like they cannot come forward with their sexual abuse. But something that is so important for us as counselors is to create a safe place where they can feel like they can talk about it and that they can share it with us. As team members, we're aware that sadly child abuse will not stop, and that's a really hard thing to think about. But all we can do as counselors is to be present in their pain and walk with them. We just need to create a good connection with all of our clients that will allow for healing, and will show them that there are people who want to hear about what happened to them, and we want to walk with them and be present in their pain. And here are our references. Yay.